My parents told me my stable relationship made my sister feel bad about her dating problems. When they skipped my wedding, I decided to move on without them. But it only got worse from there. I never thought my happiness could be a problem for anyone. But I guess I was wrong about that. The whole thing started last spring when I brought Delpha to my dad's birthday dinner. And honestly, I should have seen the warning signs right then and there, but I was too caught up in how good everything was going in my life to notice the storm brewing around me. Delpha and I had been dating for about 8 months at that point, and things were amazing between us in a way that felt natural and easy, like we just fit together without having to force anything or walk on eggshells around each other. He made me laugh every single day, and he actually listened when I talked about work or my hobbies or whatever random thing was on my mind. And he never made me feel like I was too much or not enough or anything other than exactly who I was supposed to be. We'd talk for hours about everything and nothing, and even the quiet moments felt comfortable instead of awkward. And I found myself looking forward to seeing him every single day in a way that I'd never experienced with anyone else before. So when my dad's 55th birthday came around, I was excited to bring Delpha to meet more of my family, because he'd already met my mom and stepdad a few weeks earlier, and they absolutely loved him. My mom kept texting me afterwards about how polite and funny he was, and how she could see how happy he made me just by the way I smiled when I looked at him. And my stepdad actually asked if Delpha wanted to go fishing with him the next weekend, which was basically his seal of approval since he usually takes forever to warm up to new people. But my dad's side of the family was different, and I knew that going in because there was always some kind of drama or tension whenever we all got together, usually centered around my half-sister Rebecca, who was 28, but still acted like she was 16 most of the time. Rebecca had this pattern where she'd fall head over heels for guys who were obviously wrong for her, like the married coworker who strung her along for 6 months before ghosting her, or the guy who was still living with his ex-girlfriend, but swore they were just roommates, or the one who borrowed $3,000 from her and then blocked her number when she asked for it back. Every single time Rebecca got involved with one of these disasters, she'd call my dad and stepmom, crying about how she couldn't understand why this kept happening to her, and they'd drop everything to rush over to her apartment with ice cream and tissues and reassurances that it wasn't her fault and she just had bad luck with men. They'd spend hours analyzing every text message and conversation trying to figure out what went wrong and how she could avoid it next time, and then they'd badmouth the guy to anyone who would listen and talk about how Rebecca deserves so much better than these losers who didn't appreciate what an amazing woman she was. The problem was that Rebecca never learned anything from these experiences because my dad and stepmom always swooped in to fix everything for her instead of letting her deal with the consequences of her choices. They'd pay her rent when she spent her grocery money on expensive gifts for whatever guy she was chasing, and they'd co-sign loans when her credit got messed up from all the financial mistakes she made trying to impress men who didn't care about her, and they'd even let her move back into their house whenever things got really bad, which happened at least twice a year like clockwork. So when I walked into my dad's birthday dinner, holding Delpha's hand and smiling because I was genuinely happy to be there with him, I thought everyone would be glad to see me doing well for once. I'd had my share of relationship disasters in my early 20s, including a 2-year engagement that ended when my fiancé decided he wasn't ready for marriage after all, and I'd spent a lot of time single and working on myself before I met Delpha. So I figured my family would be excited that I'd found someone who treated me right. But the atmosphere in the restaurant felt weird from the moment we sat down, and I couldn't figure out what was wrong at first, because everyone was being polite and asking Delpha the normal getting-to-know-you questions about his job and where he grew up and how we met. Delpha was being his usual charming self, telling funny stories about his work as a physical therapist and asking thoughtful questions about everyone else's lives. And I could see that my dad actually liked him, even though he was trying to play it cool. Rebecca was there too, and she'd just gotten dumped the week before by some guy she met on a dating app who turned out to be using photos from 5 years ago and lied about basically everything on his profile. She'd been texting me all week about what a nightmare the whole thing was and how she couldn't believe she'd wasted 2 months talking to this person who wasn't even real, and how she was starting to think there were no good men left in the world and maybe she should just get a bunch of cats and give up on dating entirely. I'd tried to be supportive when she was telling me all this, but honestly, I was getting tired of having the same conversation with her over and over again about how she kept getting involved with obviously problematic guys and then acting shocked when things didn't work out. I never said that to her directly because I didn't want to be mean, but I was starting to think that maybe she needed to take a break from dating and figure out why she kept making the same mistakes instead of just jumping right back into the same patterns with different people. Anyway, Rebecca was sitting across from me at dinner looking miserable and picking at her food while everyone else was having normal conversations. And I felt bad for her because breakups always suck even when you should have seen them coming. But then Delpha started telling this story about a patient of his who was this elderly man learning to walk again after hip surgery and how determined and positive the guy was, even though the recovery was really difficult. And I was laughing at the funny parts and just enjoying listening to him talk because he was such a good storyteller. That's when my stepmom Karen made this comment about how it must be nice to be so carefree and happy all the time. And there was something in her tone that made me look up from my dinner to see what she meant by that. She was looking at me with this expression I couldn't quite read, but it wasn't friendly. And I suddenly realized that Rebecca had tears in her eyes and was staring down at her plate like she was trying not to cry. I felt terrible because I hadn't been thinking about how my happiness might be hard for Rebecca to deal with when she was going through a rough patch. So I tried to change the subject and ask her about her new job, but she just shrugged and said it was fine and didn't elaborate. The rest of dinner was awkward after that, with weird silences and forced conversation, and I kept catching Karen and my dad exchanging looks. Delpha and I left as soon as we politely could, and on the drive home he asked me if everything was okay because the vibe had gotten pretty strange there toward the end. I told him about Rebecca's recent breakup and said I thought maybe I'd been insensitive by being too obviously happy when she was feeling down, and Delpha said he understood, but that I shouldn't have to hide the fact that I was in a good relationship just to make other people feel better about their problems. I thought that was the end of it. But the next morning I got a text from Karen asking if we could talk. So I called her thinking she wanted to discuss what happened at dinner and maybe clear the air. But instead she launched into this whole speech about how she'd been observing my behavior lately. And she was concerned that I was being insensitive to Rebecca's struggles by flaunting my relationship in front of her when she was going through such a difficult time. I was confused because I hadn't thought I was flaunting anything. And I told Karen that I was just being myself and sharing my life with my family the same way I always did. But she said that bringing Delpha to family events and talking about our relationship and looking so obviously happy was hurtful to Rebecca, who was already feeling bad about herself and her dating life, and that I needed to be more considerate of her feelings. I asked Karen what exactly she wanted me to do about it, and she said that maybe I should tone down the public displays of affection and avoid talking about Delpha so much when Rebecca was around, and that I should try to be more supportive of Rebecca instead of just focusing on my own happiness all the time. I pointed out that I had been supportive of Rebecca through all her relationship drama over the years, and that I'd listened to her vent about her problems countless times without ever making it about me or my own relationships. But Karen said that wasn't the same thing, and that right now, Rebecca needed extra support from her family because she was going through a particularly rough period with dating, and that it would mean a lot to her if I could just be more sensitive about how I acted around her until she got back on her feet. I said I'd try to be more aware of how I came across, but that I didn't think it was fair to ask me to hide my happiness or pretend my relationship wasn't going well just to protect Rebecca's feelings. That conversation bothered me for days afterwards because something about it felt off. But I couldn't quite put my finger on what was wrong with Karen's logic. I talked to Delpha about it, and he said it sounded like they were asking me to make myself smaller to accommodate Rebecca's issues, which wasn't healthy for anyone involved, but I didn't want to cause problems with my family. So I decided to try to be more low-key about my relationship when I was around them, even though it felt weird and fake. The next family gathering was my cousin's graduation party a few weeks later, and I went by myself because Delpha had to work that weekend. But I still got weird looks from Karen and my dad whenever I smiled or laughed at someone's joke. Rebecca was there with a new guy she'd started seeing who seemed nice enough at first. But as the afternoon went on, it became obvious that he was one of those people who thinks he's way smarter than everyone else and needs to correct or contradict everything anyone says in conversation. I watched Rebecca hanging on this guy's every word, even when he was being condescending to other people. And I could see my dad and Karen exchanging concerned looks, but they didn't say anything to her about it at the time. Instead, after the party was over, Karen pulled me aside and said she'd noticed that I seemed much more relaxed and pleasant when Delpha wasn't around, and that maybe it would be better if I came to family events solo for a while until Rebecca got more settled in her new relationship. I was stunned because that wasn't what we'd agreed on at all. and I told Karen that I thought we were just talking about me being more sensitive, not about excluding Delpha from family events entirely. But she said that his presence seemed to make things harder for Rebecca, and that it would only be temporary until she felt more secure about her own dating life, and that it would really help the family dynamic if I could just go along with this for now. I said absolutely not, because Delpha was my partner and I wasn't going to treat him like some dirty secret just because Rebecca couldn't handle seeing other people in happy relationships. Karen got defensive and said I was being selfish and putting my own desires ahead of my sister's emotional well-being, and that if I really cared about Rebecca, I would be willing to make this small sacrifice to help her get through a difficult time. But it didn't feel small to me at all. And I told Karen that Rebecca was 28 years old and needed to learn how to deal with her own problems instead of expecting everyone else to rearrange their lives around her feelings. Karen said I was being cruel and unsympathetic, and that Rebecca had always struggled with relationships and needed support from her family instead of judgment and criticism. I pointed out that the reason Rebecca kept struggling was because my dad and Karen never let her face the consequences of her poor choices, and that always swooping in to rescue her or make everyone else accommodate her problems wasn't actually helping her grow or learn anything. Karen said that was a horrible thing to say about my own sister, and that she couldn't believe I was being so cold and selfish when Rebecca needed me the most. The conversation escalated from there, with Karen accusing me of being jealous of the attention Rebecca got from my dad, and me pointing out that I was actually trying to live my own independent adult life instead of constantly creating drama that required family intervention. By the end of it, we were both pretty angry, and Karen said maybe I needed to take some time to think about what kind of sister and daughter I wanted to be, and that I was welcome to rejoin family activities when I was ready to be more supportive and less self-centered. I left feeling like I genuinely couldn't understand how wanting to bring my boyfriend to family events made me selfish or unsupportive. I've been nothing but patient with Rebecca's constant relationship disasters for years, and I'd never made her feel bad about her choices, even when they were obviously terrible decisions that anyone could see coming from a mile away. When I told Delpha what happened, he was furious on my behalf and said that my family was being completely unreasonable and manipulative. He said it sounded like they had this unhealthy dynamic where Rebecca got to be the center of attention whenever she had problems, and anyone who didn't participate in that drama was treated like they were being mean or unsupportive, and that it wasn't fair to me at all. I didn't hear from my dad or Karen for almost 2 weeks after the confrontation, which was unusual because we normally talked or texted at least a few times a week. I kept waiting for one of them to reach out and apologize, or at least try to find some kind of compromise. But my phone stayed quiet except for occasional texts from Rebecca complaining about her new boyfriend and how he was starting to show his true colors. Finally, my dad called me one evening and said he'd been thinking about everything that happened, and that he agreed with Karen that I'd been insensitive to Rebecca's situation and that maybe some time apart would be good for everyone. He said that until I was ready to be more considerate of Rebecca's feelings and more supportive of the family as a whole, it would be better if I didn't attend family gatherings, because my attitude was creating tension and making things harder for everyone else. I asked him if he was seriously telling me not to come to family events because I was too happy in my relationship. And he said that wasn't what this was about, but that my behavior had been selfish and hurtful, and that actions have consequences. I said fine, if that's how he felt about it, then I would respect his wishes and stay away from family events, but that I thought he was making a huge mistake and prioritizing Rebecca's inability to handle her own problems over his relationship with me. He said that if I was going to be stubborn and refuse to see how my actions were affecting other people, then maybe some distance would help me gain some perspective on the situation. I said that maybe he was right about the distance part because I was getting tired of being made to feel guilty for having a healthy relationship when everyone else was so focused on enabling Rebecca's dysfunction. After I hung up, I sat in my car in the parking lot outside my office and just cried for about 20 minutes because I couldn't believe that my own father was essentially banishing me from the family because I wasn't willing to pretend to be miserable to make my half-sister feel better about her poor life choices. It felt like some kind of bizarro world where being happy and stable was treated like a character flaw, and where causing constant drama was rewarded with attention and support. Delpha found me when I got home and took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug without even asking what was wrong. and I told him the whole conversation while he rubbed my back and let me cry into his shirt. He said that my family was toxic and that I deserved better than to be treated like my happiness was some kind of burden or inconvenience to other people, and that maybe this forced break from them would actually be a good thing because it would give me some space to see how messed up the whole dynamic really was. I thought he might be right about that, because the more I thought about it, the more I realized that my dad and Karen had always treated Rebecca like she was fragile and needed constant protection from reality while expecting me to be independent and handle my own problems without any support or recognition. Whenever I had relationship troubles in the past, they'd listen politely for a few minutes and then change the subject or give me generic advice about how things would work out eventually. But with Rebecca, they'd spend hours analyzing every detail and coming up with elaborate plans to help her feel better. Over the next few weeks, I found myself actually enjoying the break from family drama because I didn't have to worry about walking on eggshells around Rebecca or monitoring my behavior to make sure I wasn't being too happy or too successful in a way that might hurt her feelings. Delpha and I went to concerts and tried new restaurants and took weekend trips without me having to calculate whether any of it would make Rebecca feel bad about her own life. And it was refreshing to just exist without constantly second-guessing myself. My mom noticed that I seemed more relaxed when we had lunch one Saturday, and when I told her what had happened with my dad's side of the family, she was appalled. She said that asking me to hide my happiness to protect someone else's feelings was emotional manipulation, and that healthy families celebrate each other's successes instead of treating them like threats to someone else's well-being. She also pointed out that Rebecca was nearly 30 years old and had been creating the same patterns of relationship drama for over a decade, and that maybe it was time for her to take responsibility for her own choices instead of expecting everyone else to manage her emotions for her. My mom said she'd watched this dynamic play out for years, and that she'd always worried that my dad and Karen were doing Rebecca more harm than good by never letting her experience the natural consequences of her decisions. Meanwhile, Rebecca kept texting me periodically to complain about her new boyfriend who had turned out to be just as problematic as all the others, but in different ways. He was financially irresponsible and expected her to pay for everything. And he had a temper that he took out on service workers and people he considered beneath him, and he was starting to make comments about how she should dress and act that made her uncomfortable, but that she wasn't sure how to address. I found myself getting frustrated with these texts because it was so obvious that she was dating another loser. But I knew that if I pointed that out, she'd get defensive and accuse me of being unsupportive just like my dad and Karen had done. So I mostly just sent back generic responses like, "That sounds hard and you deserve better," which felt fake but seemed to be what she was looking for. After about 6 weeks of this forced arrangement from my dad's side of the family, Delpha and I were having dinner at our favorite restaurant when he suddenly got this serious look on his face and said he had something important to ask me. My heart started racing because I thought he might be about to break up with me, but instead he pulled out a ring box and asked if I wanted to spend the rest of our lives making each other happy. I said yes before he even finished the question, because being with Delpha had taught me what it felt like to be truly seen and valued and supported by another person, and I couldn't imagine wanting to build a life with anyone else. The ring was perfect, simple and elegant without being flashy. And when I put it on, it felt like it had always belonged on my finger. We spent the rest of dinner talking about our future together, about the house we wanted to buy, and the trips we wanted to take, and the kind of life we wanted to build, and everything felt possible and exciting in a way that I'd never experienced before. We decided that we didn't want a long engagement because we were both ready to start our married life together, and that we'd rather have a small, intimate wedding with just the people who really mattered to us, instead of a big expensive production that would stress us out for months. When we got home that night, I started making a mental list of the people I wanted to call with the news. And I realized that my dad and Karen weren't on it. The thought of telling them about the engagement filled me with dread instead of excitement because I knew they'd find some way to make it about Rebecca and how my happiness was insensitive to her struggles. Or they'd use it as an opportunity to lecture me about how I needed to fix our relationship before I could move forward with my life. I decided to call my mom first, and she screamed with joy when I told her the news and immediately started crying happy tears and asking to see the ring over video chat. She said she'd known Delpha was the one for me from the first time she met him, and that she'd never seen me as genuinely happy and comfortable with anyone as I was with him, and that she couldn't wait to welcome him officially into the family. Then I called my best friend who had introduced me to Delpha in the first place, and she said she'd been waiting for this call for months because it was so obvious that we were perfect for each other. We spent an hour on the phone talking about wedding plans and venues and dresses, and she immediately offered to be my maid of honor, which made me cry because I was so grateful to have people in my life who were genuinely excited about my happiness. But when it came time to call my dad, I kept putting it off because I didn't want to deal with whatever complicated reaction he was going to have. I knew that announcing my engagement would somehow become about how I was being inconsiderate to Rebecca, or how I should have waited until she was in a better place in her own life, or how I was being selfish by moving forward with my plans when our family relationships were strained. Finally, Delpha asked me why I seemed stressed about telling my dad about the engagement, and I explained that I was worried about how he and Karen would react given everything that had happened over the past few months. Delpha said that their opinion shouldn't matter when it came to our decision to get married, and that if they couldn't be happy for us, then that was their problem, not ours. He was right, but it still felt awful to know that my own father would probably find some way to make my engagement about someone else's problems, instead of just being happy that his daughter had found someone who loved her. I realized that I'd been hoping that the engagement might somehow fix our relationship. Like maybe such obviously good news would snap him out of whatever weird mindset he'd been in and make him remember that he was supposed to care about my happiness too. But when I finally worked up the courage to call him a few days later, the conversation went exactly as badly as I'd expected it to. He congratulated me in this flat, unenthusiastic tone, and then immediately started asking questions about the timeline and whether we were planning a big wedding and how much it was going to cost, like he was interviewing me for a job instead of celebrating with his daughter. When I told him we were thinking about a small ceremony in the fall with just close family and friends, he said that sounded nice, but then he paused and said he hoped I understood that the situation with our family was still unresolved and that it might be awkward to have everyone together for a wedding when there were still hurt feelings and unresolved issues. I asked him what he meant by that, and he said that Karen was still upset about our last conversation and that Rebecca was going through a particularly difficult time right now again because her latest relationship had ended badly, and that maybe we should think about waiting until things were more settled before planning a big family celebration. I couldn't believe he was actually suggesting that I postpone my wedding because Rebecca had broken up with another loser boyfriend. So I said that Delpha and I weren't going to put our lives on hold while we waited for Rebecca to get her act together, and that if my dad and Karen couldn't be supportive of my engagement, then maybe they shouldn't come to the wedding at all. He got defensive and said that wasn't what he was saying, but that timing mattered, and that it would be better for everyone if we could resolve our family issues before adding more stress to the situation. I said that the only family issue was that he and Karen had decided that my happiness was somehow a threat to Rebecca's well-being, and that I wasn't going to apologize for having a healthy relationship or for wanting to marry someone who treated me well. The conversation went downhill from there, with my dad accusing me of being stubborn and uncompromising, and me pointing out that I was the only one who'd been asked to compromise anything, while Rebecca continued to get endless support and accommodation for her poor choices. By the end of it, he said that if that's how I felt about it, then maybe it would be better if we all took more time to cool off before trying to discuss this further. I hung up feeling like I couldn't believe that my own father was essentially telling me that my engagement was an inconvenience to him. Delpha found me crying in the kitchen and held me while I told him what happened. And he said that we were going to have the most beautiful wedding with the people who actually loved and supported us, and that anyone who couldn't celebrate our happiness didn't deserve to be there anyway. Over the next few weeks, I started planning the wedding with my mom and my best friend and a few other close friends. And it was amazing how much easier everything felt when I wasn't worrying about accommodating people who didn't want to be there in the first place. We found a perfect venue at a small winery outside the city, and we planned a ceremony that would be intimate and meaningful instead of trying to manage a bunch of complicated family dynamics. I kept hoping that my dad would call and apologize and ask to be involved in the wedding planning, but my phone stayed quiet, except for the occasional text from Rebecca about whatever new crisis was happening in her life. She'd finally broken up with the financially irresponsible boyfriend. But now she was obsessing over some guy from her gym who barely acknowledged her existence, and she was convinced that if she could just figure out the right way to approach him, he'd realize they were meant to be together. The whole thing was so predictable and frustrating that I found myself just deleting her texts without responding because I was tired of being expected to provide emotional support for her self-created problems while getting no support or recognition for the positive things happening in my own life. As the wedding date got closer, I had to make the difficult decision to send invitations to my dad and Karen because part of me still hoped that they'd come to their senses and want to be part of this important day in my life. But when I called to let them know that the invitation was coming, my dad said that he and Karen had discussed it and that they didn't think it would be appropriate for them to attend given the current state of our relationships. I asked him if he was seriously choosing not to come to his own daughter's wedding because I wouldn't agree to hide my happiness to make Rebecca feel better. And he said that it wasn't about that, but that there were still unresolved issues between us that needed to be addressed before we could move forward. I said that the only issue was his refusal to treat me with the same consideration and support that he gave Rebecca, and that if he was willing to miss my wedding over that, then it said everything I needed to know about his priorities. He said that I was being dramatic and making this more complicated than it needed to be, and that if I was willing to apologize for how I'd handled things and commit to being more supportive of Rebecca going forward, then we could work things out. I said that I had nothing to apologize for, and that I wasn't going to beg him to care about my happiness when he'd made it clear that Rebecca's feelings were more important to him than his relationship with me. The conversation ended with him saying that he hoped I'd reconsider my attitude and that the door was always open if I wanted to make things right, but that he couldn't support my choices when I was being so selfish and inconsiderate to the rest of the family. I said that I guess we just have to agree to disagree about what family support looked like, and that I hoped he'd be happy with his decision when he was explaining to people why he wasn't at his daughter's wedding. When I told Delpha about the conversation, he said that my dad was manipulative and emotionally abusive, and that I deserve so much better than to be treated like my happiness was conditional on making everyone else comfortable. He said that our wedding was going to be perfect because it would be filled with people who actually loved us and wanted us to be happy, and that we'd be starting our marriage surrounded by genuine support instead of toxic drama. He was absolutely right because our wedding day turned out to be the most beautiful and joyful day of my life. My mom walked me down the aisle since my dad had chosen not to be there, and she looked so proud and happy that I almost started crying before I even reached Delpha. The ceremony was everything we'd dreamed of, intimate and heartfelt, and surrounded by people who were genuinely excited to celebrate our love. My mom gave the most amazing speech at the reception about how she'd watched me grow into a woman who deserved to be cherished and supported, and how grateful she was that Delpha had come into my life to love me the way I deserved to be loved. My best friend talked about how obvious it was that Delpha and I were meant for each other and how she'd never seen two people more perfectly suited to make each other happy. The whole day felt like exactly what a wedding should be, a celebration of love and commitment surrounded by people who wanted nothing more than to see us succeed and thrive together. There was no drama or tension or anyone making demands about how we should feel or act. Just pure joy and love and support from the people who mattered most. But the aftermath of the wedding brought a whole new level of family drama that I hadn't anticipated. A few days after we got back from our honeymoon, I started getting angry texts from Karen about how hurt and betrayed she felt that we'd gone ahead with the wedding without trying harder to include them, and how she couldn't believe I was willing to destroy our family relationships over such a minor disagreement. She said that Rebecca had been devastated to see the wedding photos on social media and that it was cruel of me to flaunt my happiness when I knew she was going through a difficult time, and that I should have been more considerate of how my actions would affect other people. I was amazed that even after missing my wedding entirely, she was still trying to make it about Rebecca's feelings instead of acknowledging that maybe they'd made a mistake by not being there. I responded that I hadn't destroyed any family relationships, but that I'd simply stopped allowing my happiness to be held hostage by someone else's inability to deal with their own problems, and that if they were devastated about missing my wedding, then they should have made different choices about their priorities. I said that I'd invited them to be part of the most important day of my life, and they'd chosen not to come because supporting me would have required them to admit that their treatment of me had been wrong. Karen wrote back with this message about how I'd changed and become selfish and cold, and how the person I used to be would never have prioritized my own desires over my family's needs, and how disappointed she was in the woman I'd become. She said that Rebecca looked up to me and had always admired my strength, but that now she felt rejected and abandoned by her own sister, and that I needed to take responsibility for the pain I'd caused. I realized as I read that message that Karen was living in some alternate reality where I was supposed to be grateful for being treated like a second-class family member, and where setting boundaries and expecting basic respect was somehow selfish and cruel. She genuinely seemed to believe that I should have been honored to sacrifice my own happiness and wedding day to accommodate Rebecca's emotional issues, and that my refusal to do so made me a bad person. I decided not to respond to her message because there was clearly no point in trying to reason with someone who was so invested in maintaining this twisted dynamic where Rebecca's problems were everyone else's responsibility. Instead, I blocked her number and focused on enjoying my new marriage and the life Delpha and I were building together. My dad called a few weeks later, and I thought maybe he was going to apologize and try to repair our relationship. But instead, he launched into this speech about how my behavior since the wedding had been unacceptable and hurtful, and how I needed to reach out to Karen and Rebecca to make amends for the pain I'd caused them. He said that family was supposed to be more important than anything else, and that my willingness to cut them off over this disagreement showed that I'd lost sight of what really mattered in life. I asked him if he really thought that family was the most important thing, and if so, why he'd been willing to miss his own daughter's wedding rather than admit that he'd been treating me unfairly. I said that I'd always put family first, but that I'd finally realized that the relationship had to go both ways, and that I wasn't going to keep sacrificing my well-being to maintain connections with people who didn't value or respect me. He said that I was being dramatic, and that nobody had asked me to sacrifice my well-being, but that being part of a family sometimes meant putting other people's needs ahead of your own wants, and that my refusal to do that when Rebecca needed support showed that I was selfish and immature. I said that I'd been putting other people's needs ahead of my own for years, and that the one time I'd asked for basic consideration and respect in return, I'd been told I was being unreasonable and demanding. The conversation went in circles for another 20 minutes, with him insisting that I was wrong and needed to fix things, and me pointing out that I wasn't the one who had created the situation in the first place. Finally, I told him that I loved him, but that I wasn't going to keep having the same argument over and over, and that if he wanted a relationship with me, he needed to accept that I was an adult who deserved to be treated with the same respect and consideration that he gave Rebecca. He said that he hoped I'd come to my senses eventually and realize what I was throwing away, and that he'd be waiting for me to apologize and make things right when I was ready to be reasonable. I said that I wasn't throwing anything away, but that I was done accepting crumbs when I deserved a seat at the table, and that if he was waiting for me to apologize for wanting to be happy, then he was going to be waiting for a very long time. Delpha said that he was proud of me for standing up for myself and for us, and that he'd watched me struggle with this toxic dynamic for months without knowing how to help me see that I deserved better. He said that the people who truly loved me would never ask me to make myself smaller or hide my happiness to make them more comfortable, and that anyone who couldn't celebrate my successes wasn't really my family in any meaningful sense. Over the next few months, I got periodic updates about Rebecca's life through family and social media, and the pattern continued exactly as it always had. She'd gotten involved with the gym guy who turned out to be married, and when that predictably exploded, she'd moved on to some older divorced guy she met at a coffee shop who had 3 kids and 2 ex-wives and a whole mountain of baggage that should have been visible from space. Each new disaster followed the same script, with Rebecca calling my dad and Karen in tears about how she couldn't understand why these things kept happening to her, and them dropping everything to rush over and comfort her and analyze what went wrong. According to my cousin, who still talked to everyone, my dad had been paying Rebecca's rent for the past 3 months because she'd gotten so emotionally overwhelmed by her latest breakup that she couldn't focus at work and had been written up several times for poor performance. Meanwhile, Delpha and I were settling into married life in the most wonderful way. And every day I felt more grateful that I'd chosen to prioritize my own happiness instead of continuing to enable my family's dysfunction. We bought a little house with a garden where Delpha could grow tomatoes and herbs, and we adopted a rescue dog named Charlie who made us laugh every single day with his goofy personality and endless energy. But about 8 months after the wedding, the relative peace was shattered when my dad called me at work one afternoon, and I could tell from his tone that something was seriously wrong. He said that Rebecca had been hospitalized after what appeared to be a suicide attempt, and that she'd left a note saying that she couldn't handle feeling like such a failure compared to everyone else, and that she was tired of being the family disappointment while I got to have the perfect life. I felt like I'd been hit by a truck, because even though Rebecca and I had our issues, I'd never wanted anything terrible to happen to her. And the idea that she might have hurt herself because of anything related to me was devastating. I asked my dad if she was okay and what hospital she was at, and he said she was stable, but that the doctors wanted to keep her for observation for a few days to make sure she was safe. Then he said that the reason he was calling was because Rebecca had specifically asked for me and that she wanted to talk to me about everything that had happened between our families, and that maybe this crisis could be an opportunity for all of us to come together and heal the rift that had been tearing us apart. I said, of course I would come to the hospital if Rebecca wanted to see me, because regardless of our disagreements, she was still my half-sister and I cared about her well-being. But as I was driving to the hospital, I started feeling this creeping sense of dread about the whole situation, because something about my dad's tone had felt manipulative in a way that I couldn't quite identify. When I got to the hospital, I found my dad and Karen in the waiting room looking haggard and exhausted. And Karen immediately started crying when she saw me and said that she was so glad I'd come because Rebecca really needed to see me. My dad hugged me and said that maybe some good could come out of this terrible situation if it helped us remember what was really important and brought our family back together. I asked if I could see Rebecca, and a nurse took me to a room where she was lying in bed looking pale and tired. When she saw me, she started crying and said that she was sorry for everything that had happened and that she'd been so jealous of my happiness that she'd made herself sick, trying to compete with something she could never have. She said that watching me get married and start this beautiful life with Delpha had made her realize how empty and pathetic her own life was, and that she'd been spiraling for months trying to find someone who would love her the way Delpha loved me, but that every relationship just made her feel worse about herself. She said that the night she took the pills, she'd been looking at our wedding photos online and feeling like she would never be good enough to deserve that kind of happiness. I felt terrible listening to her talk like this because I'd never wanted my happiness to be a source of pain for anyone. And I told her that her worth as a person had nothing to do with her relationship status and that she deserved love and happiness just as much as anyone else. I said that I was sorry she'd been struggling so much and that I wished she'd felt like she could talk to me about what she was going through instead of letting it build up to this point. But then she said something that made my blood run cold, which was that my dad and Karen had told her that I'd said I thought she was pathetic and would never find anyone because she was too needy and desperate, and that I'd been laughing about her relationship problems with Delpha and making fun of her behind her back. I was shocked because I had never said anything like that about Rebecca to anyone. And the idea that my dad and Karen would lie to her about something so cruel was almost unbelievable. I told Rebecca that I had absolutely never said those things about her and that whoever told her I had was lying. And I asked her where she'd gotten that information. She looked confused and said that Karen had told her about a conversation she'd overheard between me and Delpha, where we were supposedly making jokes about Rebecca's dating disasters and talking about how embarrassing it was to be related to someone so desperate for male attention. I was furious because I realized that Karen had completely fabricated this story to make Rebecca feel even worse about herself and to paint me as some kind of villain who was mocking her pain. I told Rebecca that the conversation she was describing had never happened, and that I would never say those kinds of things about her or anyone else, and that Karen had lied to her for reasons that I couldn't understand. Rebecca looked uncertain and said that Karen had seemed so sure about what she'd heard and that it had felt true because of how successful and happy I seemed compared to how miserable she was. I said that my happiness didn't have anything to do with her struggles and that comparing our lives wasn't fair to either of us because we were different people with different circumstances and different choices. I spent about an hour with Rebecca, talking through some of her feelings and trying to help her see that her worth wasn't determined by her relationship status and that she had lots of good qualities and talents that had nothing to do with whether she was dating someone. By the time I left, she seemed a little more stable and said that she was grateful I'd come to see her and that maybe we could work on rebuilding our relationship once she got out of the hospital. But when I went back to the waiting room, I was absolutely livid about what Karen had done, and I confronted her about the lies she'd told Rebecca about me, supposedly mocking her. Karen got defensive and said that she'd never told Rebecca anything like that, and that maybe Rebecca had misunderstood something or gotten confused because of her emotional state. I said that Rebecca had been very specific about what Karen had supposedly overheard, and that it was obvious that someone had deliberately fed her false information to make her feel worse about herself and to turn her against me. Karen said that I was being paranoid, and that nobody was trying to turn anyone against me, and that maybe I should focus on supporting Rebecca instead of creating more drama during a family crisis. My dad jumped in and said that this wasn't the time or place for accusations and arguments, and that we all needed to come together to support Rebecca instead of fighting with each other. I said that I absolutely wanted to support Rebecca, but that I wasn't going to stand by while someone lied about me to manipulate her emotions, and that whoever had told her those things about me owed her an apology and an explanation. The whole thing escalated into this huge argument right there in the hospital waiting room, with Karen accusing me of being selfish and making Rebecca's crisis about myself, and me pointing out that someone in this family had a pattern of lying and manipulating situations to create drama, and that Rebecca's emotional state was being used as a weapon against me, just like it always had been. Finally, my dad said that if I couldn't be supportive during this difficult time, then maybe I should leave, because Rebecca didn't need the stress of family conflict while she was trying to recover. I said that I'd been nothing but supportive of Rebecca, but that I wasn't going to let anyone use her vulnerability as an excuse to lie about me or manipulate the situation for their own purposes. I left the hospital feeling like I'd been put through a meat grinder, because the whole thing had felt like such a setup to make me look like the bad guy and to force me back into the dysfunctional family dynamic that I'd worked so hard to escape. It was like they'd used Rebecca's genuine emotional crisis as an opportunity to drag me back into their web of manipulation and guilt. And I felt sick about the whole thing. When I got home and told Delpha what had happened, he was absolutely furious about the lies Karen had told Rebecca about me. And he said that using someone's suicide attempt as a way to manipulate family relationships was one of the most disgusting things he'd ever heard of. He said that even if Rebecca's crisis was genuine, the way my dad and Karen had handled it was abusive and wrong, and that I shouldn't feel guilty about refusing to participate in their toxic games. Over the next few days, I got several calls from my dad asking me to come back to the hospital and spend more time with Rebecca, and saying that she was asking for me, and that my presence seemed to help her feel better. But every time I went, Karen would be there too, and she'd make these passive-aggressive comments. Finally, after about a week of this, I told my dad that I would continue to support Rebecca as much as I could, but that I wasn't going to pretend that the problems in our family relationships were my fault, and that using Rebecca's crisis to try to manipulate me into accepting blame for things I didn't do was making the whole situation worse for everyone. He said that nobody was trying to manipulate anyone, and that if I really cared about Rebecca, I would be willing to take responsibility for my part in her emotional breakdown. I said that I cared about Rebecca very much, but that I wasn't responsible for her mental health or her relationship problems, and that suggesting otherwise was unfair to both of us. Rebecca was released from the hospital a few days later with a plan for outpatient therapy and medication management, and I made sure to check in with her regularly to see how she was doing and to offer whatever support I could provide. But I also maintained my boundaries with my dad and Karen, because I could see that they were still trying to use the situation to guilt me into accepting their version of events and apologizing for things I hadn't done. I finally had enough. I told him that I'd tried for months to maintain some kind of relationship, despite the way they treated me, and that I'd continue to support Rebecca even after they'd used her crisis to try to manipulate me, but that I was done being the family scapegoat while they painted themselves as the victims of my supposed selfishness. He said that I was being dramatic, and that family was more important than pride, and that if I walked away from them over this, then I'd regret it for the rest of my life. I said that the only thing I regretted was wasting so much time and energy trying to maintain relationships with people who were determined to see me as the villain, no matter what I did, and that I was finally ready to accept that some people would never change. That was the last conversation I had with my dad, and it's been over a year since then. Rebecca and I text occasionally, and she's doing much better with therapy and has started setting some boundaries with our dad and Karen that are helping her develop more independence and self-awareness.